The courtroom was still. Not the tense kind of silence that follows outrage, but the deep, echoing quiet that comes after something irreversible. Richard Langford sat where he had been for hours, hands folded, shoulders heavy, the last man in a room that had decided what his life would mean. The others had gone. The attorneys with their briefcases, the reporters chasing their next story, and even the judge, whose gavel still seemed to hum faintly in his ears. The light through the tall windows was gray, muted by a drizzle that had begun sometime during closing arguments. Outside, car tires whispered over wet pavement, but in here, everything stood still. On the table beside him lay a small folded note. No envelope, no name, just his initials in a woman's handwriting he knew by heart. He didn't open it right away. He let his fingers rest on it first, as if trying to feel the warmth of a hand that once wrote to him with tenderness, not obligation. When he finally unfolded it, the words were short, almost hesitant. "I never stopped caring. I just stopped pretending." He read them again, slower this time, as if the meaning might soften on a second pass. But it didn't. It stayed sharp. The kind of truth that doesn't wound out of cruelty, but out of necessity. The papers rustled faintly as he set the note down. He exhaled, long, quiet, unsteady. The weight of reputation, love, and consequence had collapsed into one line of ink. Outside, thunder rolled gently over the city. It wasn't angry, just weary, like him. And in that sound, Richard Langford realized that maybe this wasn't punishment. Maybe it was the only form of freedom left to him, one that required losing everything he thought he could control. It had all begun in a place that looked too ordinary to hold consequence, a morning staff meeting at Langford Industries. Richard remembered the details easily, not because they were dramatic, but because that's how change usually arrives, quietly, disguised as routine. She had walked in late. Emily Rhodes, 26, new to the company, carrying a folder too big for her arms. There was an apology in her smile, the kind that wasn't rehearsed. He noticed that before he noticed anything else. For a man used to people speaking to his title instead of his name, her voice felt like light cutting through years of boardroom formality. After the meeting, she'd lingered, asking questions that went beyond the presentation, not about profit margins or projections, but about purpose, about legacy. And though her curiosity was youthful, her tone carried an honesty he hadn't heard in years. It should have ended there. A brief encounter, a pleasant impression, one moment among thousands in a long corporate life. But that evening, when the building emptied and the storm came, she was still there, sorting files while others rushed home. When the lights flickered, she laughed. When the thunder cracked, she didn't flinch. He offered to drive her home. She declined, politely. Then she thanked him for noticing her work. No one had said that to him in years. Not like that. As she walked toward the elevator, Richard Langford felt something he couldn't name. Not attraction. Not yet. It was the strange ache of being seen after decades of invisibility behind success. That night, long after his driver dropped him at his quiet, echoing house, he poured himself a drink and sat by the window. The city lights shimmered through the rain, and in the reflection of his glass, he saw not the man who owned a company, but the man who had forgotten how it felt to be surprised by kindness. He didn't know it then, but Emily Rhodes had already become the thought that wouldn't leave him. It began innocently. 2 coffee cups left side by side at the corner cafe across from the office. The first time, it was coincidence. The second, perhaps convenience. By the third, they both stopped pretending it was either. Emily Rhodes liked her coffee sweet. Richard Langford drank his black. They'd sit near the window, her speaking softly about campaigns and color palettes, him listening, sometimes smiling in ways he hadn't in years. There was never a declaration, never a line crossed in words. But in the way her eyes lingered when he spoke of his late nights at the office, or the way his hand would hover near hers without ever touching, there was something that lived quietly between them, a kind of reverence disguised as restraint. He began noticing her absence more than her presence. When she missed a meeting, he'd glance at the empty chair. When she laughed across the hallway, the sound found him. It wasn't infatuation. It was something quieter, older, the kind of affection that grows where loneliness has long settled. People began to notice. The glances, the shared walks to the parking lot, the way time seemed to bend around them when they were together. Richard told himself it was harmless, that he could control it, like every decision he'd ever made in business. But love, he was learning, is not a boardroom negotiation. It doesn't wait for permission, or logic, or perfect timing. He started writing letters again, something he hadn't done since college. Not to send, but to remember. He wrote about her laughter, her curiosity, the way she made the room feel alive without trying. In one of those letters, he wrote a line that would never leave him. "She reminds me of who I was before I started chasing everything that didn't matter." And though no one would ever read those words, they marked the quiet beginning of something neither of them would be able to undo. The night that changed everything didn't begin like a scandal. It began like a celebration. Langford Industries was hosting its annual gala, a night of shimmering gowns, polished speeches, and photographs meant for glossy magazines. Richard Langford, as always, stood where the light was brightest. Beside him, board members smiled, partners raised glasses, and the hum of success filled the room like static. Emily Rhodes had been invited as part of the marketing team. Her blue dress wasn't extravagant, just simple, elegant, the kind that drew attention by not seeking it. They crossed paths near the grand staircase. She congratulated him on his speech. He thanked her for the campaign that made it possible. It was brief, professional, harmless, until the flash went off. One photograph. Her hand resting lightly on his arm, his smile soft, too soft for a CEO in public view. By morning, it was everywhere. The CEO and the assistant, an affair of power and age. The caption was cruel, but the image was enough. Caroline Langford, his estranged wife, saw it first. She didn't call him. She didn't shout. She simply forwarded the article to his private email with a single line. "So this is who you've become." The board met the next day in tense silence. Investors demanded explanations. Reporters called his assistant nonstop. Emily resigned before noon. He tried to reach her. Once, twice, more than he should have. No answer. Only the ringing sound of consequences catching up to tenderness. That evening, he found himself standing before the photograph again, printed across headlines, dissected by strangers. He studied it the way a man might study evidence at his own trial. There was no guilt in the image, no sin. Just two people who had forgotten that the world never forgives sincerity when it comes from the wrong age, the wrong title, the wrong time. And in that frozen frame, Richard Langford understood that love wasn't what had doomed him. Visibility was. The weeks that followed the photograph felt endless. Not because of noise, but because of silence. At first, Richard Langford tried to go on as usual. He attended meetings, signed papers, shook hands. But even the smallest glance carried meaning now. The smiles were polite, the conversations shorter. People spoke to him differently. Not as the man who had built the company, but as the story whispered in elevators. Emily Rhodes vanished from the building. Her desk cleared overnight, her name removed from the internal directory. No goodbye, no explanation, only the faint scent of her perfume lingering near the marketing floor, a reminder that what they'd shared had turned into a stain no one would touch. Richard wanted to believe time would wash it away. He'd weathered crises before, economic ones, political ones, even personal ones. But this wasn't like those. This was reputation, and reputation has no mercy. He wrote her a letter, not to persuade, but to apologize. He told her that he never meant for her to carry his shadow, that she had simply walked into a life already watched by too many eyes. He sealed it, but never mailed it. In the boardroom, rumors hardened into resolutions. Some demanded his resignation. Others urged him to control the narrative. But control was the very thing slipping away from him. At home, the walls felt wider, emptier. The echo of footsteps where laughter once belonged reminded him that success had never kept him company. Not really. He told himself he was protecting her by staying silent. But deep down, he knew. The moment he let her walk away without fighting, he had chosen pride over love. And pride, as he was learning, doesn't just isolate, it erases. Months passed. The city moved on, as it always does. But silence doesn't mean peace. Sometimes it's just distance growing roots. Then, one afternoon, a courier arrived at his office with an envelope marked confidential. The weight of it told him everything before he even opened it. Inside were pages of legal print, her name in bold, his name in defense. Allegations of emotional manipulation, unfair treatment, and a relationship in conflict with corporate ethics. It wasn't her tone in those words. He could tell. This was the language of lawyers, precise, cold, stripped of the warmth that once existed between them. Still, it cut. Not because of guilt, but because of what it meant. That the woman who once sat across from him at a cafe was now seated on the other side of a courtroom table. His son, Oliver, confronted him that evening. "You should have known better, Dad," he said. It wasn't anger, just disappointment. A quiet kind that lingered longer than rage. Richard didn't argue. He knew there were no words that could make the world see the truth, that love, real love, had lived there, even if it was unwise. The press returned. Headlines bloomed again like weeds after rain. The CEO's fall continues, accused by former assistant. Talk shows debated him, strangers reduced his life to sound bites. He wanted to hate her for it, but he couldn't. Because even now, in the heart of betrayal, he still remembered the softness in her voice that day in the storm, when she laughed as papers flew across the floor. He knew she was hurting too, maybe cornered by circumstance, maybe guided by others. Either way, the love they once shared had become something neither recognized. In the sleepless nights that followed, he began to understand the cruel symmetry of it all. He had built a world ruled by contracts, and now love itself had been reduced to one. And as he stared at the lawsuit lying open on his desk, Richard Langford whispered to the empty room, "Love never asked to be defended." The courtroom felt colder than it looked. The air was still, the walls high, and every sound, every cough, every rustle of paper, carried too far. Richard Langford sat at the defense table, hands clasped, face steady. He had rehearsed this moment 100 times, but nothing prepares a man to see love turned into evidence. Across the aisle sat Emily Rhodes. She avoided his eyes at first, her posture straight, her expression calm in that practiced way that only heartbreak can teach. When she finally looked at him, just for a second, he saw not accusation, but sorrow. Deep, exhausted sorrow. The questions began. Dates, meetings, messages. How many times had they been alone? How many dinners? How many compliments had crossed the invisible line between mentorship and affection? Each answer became a nail, hammered slowly by voices that didn't know either of them. Her lawyer's tone was clinical, his own was measured. There was no shouting, no spectacle, just the slow unraveling of dignity in the name of truth. When she spoke, her voice trembled. "I never wanted any of this," she said softly. And in that instant, the entire courtroom seemed to breathe differently. He could have denied. He could have blamed misunderstanding. But Richard Langford didn't lie. He admitted to caring. He admitted to crossing the line not with intention, but with feeling. And that, the judge noted, was enough. The verdict wasn't dramatic. No slamming gavel, no raised voices, just quiet words read into the record. Liability acknowledged. Reputation diminished. Company fined. But the true punishment wasn't in the judgment. It was in the silence that followed, the sound of two lives severed by the same truth that once bound them. When the court adjourned, he remained seated a moment longer, watching her gather her papers with shaking hands. He wanted to tell her that he forgave her, that he never saw her as an enemy, but love had no place left to stand. And as she walked out, the echo of her heels on the polished floor became the longest goodbye he'd ever heard. It arrived weeks later, a plain white envelope with no return address, slipped quietly through the mail slot. He almost didn't open it. He'd learned that paper, in his life, often carried ruin. But something about the handwriting stopped him. He'd know those curved letters anywhere. He took the letter to his study, sat in the same leather chair where he once signed contracts worth millions, and unfolded the page. "Richard," it began, "I never wanted the world to see us this way. I wanted to protect what we had, but I didn't know how to live under its shadow. I thought walking away would free us both. I see now that it only turned love into silence." He read it twice, tracing each word like a wound he both needed and feared. There was no bitterness in her tone, no defense or denial, just the quiet truth of someone who had tried and failed to do the right thing. She ended with a line that stilled him completely. "I hope someday you'll remember me not for how it ended, but for how it began, in kindness." He folded the letter carefully and set it beside the note she'd left on the day of the verdict. 2 small pages, carrying the entire weight of what neither of them could say aloud. Outside, the evening sky turned the color of old silver. Rain streaked the glass again. Thin, uncertain, he watched it fall and thought of the cafe where it all began, the storm that brought them together, the sound of her laughter between thunderclaps. He realized then that love doesn't disappear when it's lost. It lingers, reshaping itself into memory, into quiet forgiveness, into a kind of peace no courtroom could ever take away. That night, Richard Langford left his desk light on, not because he was working, but because the room finally felt less empty when it wasn't dark. The first morning back at Langford Industries felt different. Not quieter, just hollow. A building can hum with noise and still feel abandoned when the soul of it is gone. Richard Langford walked through the halls that once echoed with greetings and soft laughter. Now voices lowered when he passed. Eyes shifted. Even the air seemed cautious around him. He reached his office, large, immaculate, overlooking the city skyline he had conquered. It was exactly as he'd left it. But her chair, the one she used to pull close when reviewing campaign drafts, sat untouched in the corner. A small plant still stood on the shelf behind it, wilted but not dead. He couldn't bring himself to throw it away. He sat at his desk and stared at the framed photo taken years ago, the one with his son Oliver at the company's opening ceremony. Oliver's smile was wide then, proud. Now, their conversations lasted minutes, punctuated by silence and restraint. The phone rang twice that morning. Reporters still wanted comments. He declined them all. There was nothing left to defend. When truth becomes public property, it stops belonging to the people who lived it. Around noon, he walked through the marketing floor, the place she used to sit, humming softly while typing. A new nameplate gleamed on her old desk. Different handwriting, different perfume, but he could still feel her presence there, like warmth fading from a room long after the fire's out. In the days that followed, Richard learned that absence can be louder than accusation. He began to work less, speak less. Sometimes, when meetings ended and others filed out, he would linger, listening to the faint hum of the building, the heartbeat of a legacy he'd built at the cost of everything human inside it. He'd once believed power was proof of worth. Now he knew it was only insulation. And insulation, while keeping the world out, also keeps love from getting in. That night, before leaving, he stopped by her old desk one last time. He watered the dying plant. Not out of sentiment, but out of habit. And perhaps that was the saddest part, that love could remain long after the reason for it had gone. Spring came quietly that year, as if the world had decided to move on without asking his permission. Langford Industries held its anniversary celebration, a smaller one this time, without reporters or champagne towers, just employees gathered in a hall that once pulsed with prestige. Oliver Langford stood at the podium. He was the new CEO now, confident, composed, the embodiment of what legacy demanded. His speech was flawless. He thanked the board, the clients, the team that endured through challenges. He didn't mention his father by name, but every word was edged with the weight of inheritance. From the back row, Richard listened. He didn't mind the omission. There was a quiet dignity in anonymity. He'd learned that some stories don't need telling twice. When the applause came, he joined in softly, his hands trembling slightly with age, or maybe with memory. After the event, Oliver found him by the exit. Neither spoke at first. Then, with a restrained kind of tenderness, Oliver said, "You taught me everything, Dad, even the mistakes." Richard smiled. "That's all I ever meant to," he replied. They didn't hug. They didn't need to. Sometimes reconciliation isn't an embrace. It's simply standing near each other without bitterness. Later that night, Richard returned home to his study. He poured a small glass of bourbon, opened the drawer where her letter rested, and read it again. The paper had softened with time, edges curled, but the words still carried warmth. He realized something then. The court, the company, the critics, they had all rendered judgment, but love had never been part of their verdict. It belonged only to him. He folded the letter once more, placed it back in the drawer, and turned off the light. The house fell into quiet, not the cold kind, but the gentle kind that follows understanding. Outside, the wind stirred through blooming trees, and somewhere in that sound was a trace of laughter, distant, familiar, like memory forgiving him one last time. It began as a drizzle, the kind that blurs city lights into watercolor. Richard Langford walked without an umbrella, his suit damp, his shoes darkened by the wet pavement. No one recognized him anymore. And that, strangely, felt like mercy. He passed the cafe where it had all begun. The old jazz still played through the doorway, soft and nostalgic, a rhythm that pulled him inside before he could resist. The waitress, young and kind, led him to a table by the window. She didn't know who he was, didn't ask. She just smiled the way people do when they expect nothing in return. He ordered her drink, Emily's. Vanilla latte, light foam, 1 sugar. He hadn't said those words in years, and hearing them aloud again felt like opening a time capsule. The seat across from him was empty, but somehow the air carried her presence. He could almost hear her laugh, that light, unguarded sound that once filled these walls when the storm outside rattled the glass. He reached for his wallet and paused. Inside, behind his ID, was the small photo they'd taken one afternoon. Not the famous one, not the scandal. This one was private. Her head tilted toward him slightly, his hand resting on the table, not touching hers, but near enough that it told the truth. Neither dared to speak aloud. He stared at it for a long time, long enough for the coffee to cool. Outside, thunder murmured somewhere over the river. He thought about the first rain they shared, how she'd looked up and said, "Storms don't always mean something bad, you know. Sometimes they just clean what's old." And now, walking back out into that same kind of rain, he realized she had been right. Water ran down his face like grace. Not punishment, not sorrow, just release. For the first time in years, Richard Langford stopped looking backward. He let the city move around him, each step echoing less with regret and more with understanding. Because what had broken him hadn't been love. It had been forgetting that love, even when lost, still leaves behind the courage to live again. Years passed quietly. The name Langford Industries still appeared on skyscrapers, but no longer in headlines. The world had found new stories to chase. Richard Langford retired to a small coastal town, a place where mornings began with fog and ended in gold. He kept no entourage, no office, no reminders of status. Just a modest home, a view of the water, and a wooden desk where sunlight filtered through the blinds. On that desk sat 2 letters, the ones she had written him long ago. He never moved them. Sometimes he'd reread a line or two. Other times he'd simply sit beside them, as if silence itself was a conversation still unfinished. He tended a small garden now. Tomatoes, basil, lavender, things that required patience, not power. And in nurturing them, he found something business had never given him: gentleness. One evening, a young journalist found him, persistent, polite, curious. She asked for an interview about the scandal. He declined at first, then reconsidered. "Tell them," he said, "that love didn't ruin me. Ambition did. And the world's appetite for judgment finished the rest." He smiled faintly. "Tell them I loved once, truly, and that was enough." The journalist hesitated. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. He looked out toward the horizon where the sun was sinking, a thin line of light turning the water silver. "Regret?" he repeated, almost to himself. "No, only that I didn't hold her hand when I had the chance." That night, as darkness settled, he sat by the window, listening to the steady hum of the ocean. A breeze moved through the curtains, carrying the faint scent of salt and lavender. He reached for the drawer beside him, took out her final letter, and whispered, "Thank you for teaching me what love costs and what it's worth." Then he set it down, closed his eyes, and let the sound of the waves fill the space where her voice used to be. Because some stories don't end in courtrooms, or in headlines, or even in apologies. They end in peace, and in the quiet knowing that love, once real, never truly leaves. Sometimes love doesn't end in fire or betrayal. Sometimes it just fades into understanding. Richard Langford learned that too late, that power can build empires, but only love leaves something worth remembering. In the end, it wasn't the verdict that defined him. It was the quiet after. The moment he looked back and realized that even loss, when faced with grace, becomes a kind of forgiveness. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments. What moment in Richard Langford's journey moved you the most? And if you were listening closely, you might notice how often Richard Langford's name came up. Drop your answer in the comments. We may feature your name in a shout-out as a thank you for being part of our Fiction Echoes family. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this one, the next chapter is already waiting. Just click the video that's about to appear, and we'll see you there. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a moment of what happens next.